Apologies again to my viewers for flipping off my co-host and his guest. But hey, listen, I have a special for you tonight, something very, very special, because you think you know Jack. Turns out we don't know Jack. We've never known Jack. We've never known Jack the Ripper. And tonight, the full hour on all of the issues that are bubbling to the surface this week with this DNA declaration that we may have actually genealogically linked DNA from a crime scene of Jack the Ripper's to an actual guy. Look, I love science and I love forensics, but there are plenty of critics too. There's so much that I thought I knew about Jack the Ripper, about his victims, about what happened to those victims. We've had sweeping descriptions, but no deep descriptions. Tonight, fair warning, big warning. A lot of really ugly, graphic details are coming. Not only am I going to talk to you about why Jack the Ripper gripped us for 135 years, but also what he did to those women. What was being said back then about the women, about the killer, and how that community was seized in fear. The headlines are just delicious. I mean, you really do want to go through these 1888 headlines with me. That's coming in just a moment as well. I'm going to take you on a tour of the actual cobblestone streets where each of these murders happened. So this is a special edition of Banfield tonight. Let me just get into it, because there is this issue of what if we're wrong? And if we're wrong, and it hasn't been solved, that name is still out there. I'm going to go over the other possible suspects too. But if you mention the crime of the century, you might think OJ. But the 19th century, that belongs to Jack the Ripper. If you think about it, of all the serial killers that live in our nightmares, Dahmer, Zodiac, Son of Sam, H.H. Holmes, the Iceman, not one of them endured like Jack the Ripper. It's mostly because the Ripper's crimes were never solved, the Ripper himself was never found, but all that tonight might change. This week, there was earth-shattering news in the true crime community. Jack the Ripper has been unmasked. A real name has been put to the nickname. And this time, it's not just conjecture and theory, it's science, forensic science, genealogy, and cold, hard evidence. It seems a blood-stained shawl found at one of the Ripper's ghastly murders also contained male DNA, semen, presumably from the murderer. That shawl was purchased by a historian who put it through the forensic paces using genealogy. That male DNA traced forward 135 years to a great-great-grandniece of a man named Aaron Kosminski. This is a rendition. This is a mock-up of what he might have looked like. Kosminski was a 23-year-old Polish immigrant who plied his trade by day as a barber. So we know that he was quick with a blade. And as it happened, Kosminski was known to the police back then. He was even a suspect, though police could never prove he did it. But if the shawl, the blood, the DNA, and Kosminski proved to be the defining moment of this ice-cold crime, have we indeed solved the greatest true crime mystery of all time? The historian behind the revelation has spent years piecing together this puzzle, even touring devotees through the deserted streets of London's East End to walk in the footsteps of history's most vexing killer.
On Saturday, the 8th of September 1888, the second murder victim fell at the hands of the world knows as Jack the Ripper. He cut her throat, virtually down to the spinal cord. There's reports somewhere saying he actually tried to cut her head off, but he didn't have the time. This doorway here was on the latch, it was never locked. So this is where the unfortunates would bring their customers into the backyard, service them, and off they went. And the number of times I've stood here over the years and wondered, you know, because this was the only one on the latch, whether there were hunters, if you like, and unfortunates standing, waiting their turn. Now the thing is, you've got to realise that the Truman Brewery, so you've got the smell of the brewery, you've got the slaughterhouses and the leather works, plus these streets where you're soaked by the homeless, downtrodden, the destitute. These are the streets of Whitechapel. For the research that I've done over the years, I've stood here, not every year, but I've stood here to wonder what it would have been like. Would it have been this dark? Would it have been this light? First you go in daylight, and people are walking to work. Spitalfields Market is just here. And yet, this murderer just vanished into thin air.
Vanished into thin air. The understatement of the century. Russell Edwards is that tour guide, that historian, and is that true crime sleuth who may have cracked a case for the ages, and he's live with me now. Mr. Edwards, thank you so much for being back with me. I so appreciate seeing you again. How certain are you? How certain are you that the Ripper is Aaron Kosminski?
Oh, without doubt, 100% it's him. You got to remember that the name of the Ripper was given to me by Scotland Yard. You mentioned about this face. This face is a facial reconstruction by an expert from the family photos that were given to me by one of the by one of the descendants. So it's not sort of like a mock-up, but that's actually what it looked like.
Let's talk about where this case actually stands. I mean, you've done this. You've, I assumed, presented this, but legally, where are we? We can't have a court case. The perpetrator is dead. He can't be tried. But what about an inquest? Where might this go? Yeah.
Okay. So we've tried with the Attorney General twice. The first time, a few years ago now, it was very obvious that they didn't even look at the letter or the case that we presented. And in fact, I put that in the book as a rebuff. They just weren't interested. The second letter came back, or the response, and let me just say it took them 6 months to respond. We did press them very hard for a response. And really the 4 questions asked of an inquest, it's who, where, how and when. It's the how that we can look at here, how the deceased came about their death. And with that, we can actually add now with the new evidence that we've got, how it was actually Catherine Eddowes, the 4th Ripper victim, how she came by her death. And with what the evidence that we have, we can actually place Aaron Kosminski at the murder scene. I mean, it's fascinating, this shawl, that it still exists 135 years later. Where is the shawl right now? Have police asked you for it? Oh, no. Do you know the most interesting thing about this shawl is it was in the police filing cabinet for over a decade, and they actually did nothing with it down in the Crime Museum. And it was the owner, who's the great-great-grandnephew of Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson, that was actually on what's called Finian duties on the night in one of the houses at Mitre Square. And he was one of the first on the scene before PC Watkins, who officially found Catherine. And he asked if he could take the shawl away with him, as his wife was a seamstress. And again, it's a very beautiful piece of material. In fact, it's about, I would say, nearly 9 foot in length and about 2.5 foot in width, as you can see there. And he took it home for his wife. Of course, she wasn't
Where
actually
is it?
very. Well, that's in a bank vault in an undisclosed location, is all I can tell you. In a bank vault. So the police had it, didn't test it. Now there are all these headlines. You have tested it. Do you think that someone is going to want you to turn the shawl over for some independent testing? Not likely. They've never knocked on the door. And when we originally did this, they certainly weren't interested. It's curious that they've sort of just not bothered. Yeah, you're not kidding. Because my next question really covers that. Why has this case gripped the globe? It is not an American fascination. It's not a British fascination. It is a global fascination. There have been murderers far worse, I dare say, than Jack the Ripper. I named some of them off the top of the show. Their names are not common parlance like Jack the Ripper. Why is it? What is it about him and his crimes that just we can't let go? It's the eternal whodunit, and in fact, you've said it. It's the name, Jack the Ripper. About 70 years before these murders, there was another set of notorious murders only up the road from these,
and yet no one would ever have heard of them, which is the Ratcliffe Highway murders. It's the name that carries this. It's the romance of the Victorian era. And of course, with this one, it's the whodunit. When you name other serial killers, they've all been caught. You know, this is the one that unofficially was caught, if you like, but never brought to trial.
Well, also the one that got away for a century and a half. I mean, if he really is unmasked at this time. Russell Edwards, can't thank you enough. So appreciate it. And I'm loving your tour. It's going to continue throughout the rest of this special. We're going to see Russell coming up. And also, just a quick note about your book. It's called Naming Jack the Ripper, The Definitive Reveal. Thank you so much for this.
Pleasure.
You know, solving the case won't just mean like justice in the true sense of the word, because there's not going to be a trial. We can't lock up the madman to punish and protect, right? But solving a case means a hell of a lot to the relatives of the victims, certainly much more than it does to you and me, crime buffs and historians. Generations later, there are family members who are trying to sort out what this Jack the Ripper news really means. Relatives of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Mary Jane Kelly, and Catherine Eddowes. Catherine was murdered on September 30th, 1888. She was the daughter of a tin plate worker. She'd been put out to work at age 15. She had 3 children by a soldier whom she never married, and she suffered deeply from alcoholism. In fact, the night that she was murdered, she'd been arrested for public drunkenness. And then she was released right into the dark streets of London's East End in the middle of the night. And that is where Catherine Eddowes met her fate at the hands of Jack the Ripper. 3 generations later, Catherine's great-great-great-grandniece is trying to make sense of the news that the Ripper has finally been unmasked. And Sharon Dutton joins me now live from London. Sharon, it's great to meet you. Thank you so much for joining me. Do you believe, Sharon, that this crime has been solved?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, you can't DNA. If that was around 135 years ago, obviously he would have been named. He'd have been caught then. But Russell has put 25 years of his life into this work to name the Ripper. And we want justice for Catherine and all the other victims. I mean, it was terrible. He didn't only murder them. He butchered these women. And I mean, Catherine, she had her bladder removed, kidney removed, and sent by post to the police. Can you imagine how her family felt hearing this terrible news? It was absolutely devastating for the family. You know, all the family and friends of Catherine. These ladies was loved.
We're so many generations later. I mean, this is your great-great-great aunt. And I want to ask our director if we can go full screen with you, because I think you might have a brooch that you're wearing tonight that actually belonged to Catherine Eddowes. I mean, it's an incredible artifact that you have. I'd love to see it, and I also would love for you to tell me what the brooch means. Can we go full screen with Sharon Dutton's picture so I can see the brooch of Catherine's?
It's a Victorian wishbone. Can you see it?
Can you lift it a little bit? Sharon, can you lift the brooch up a little bit? It's right at the bottom of the screen. There it is. That's Catherine's.
Yes, this is Catherine's. And it's been treasured from generation to generation. My mother was pregnant at the time, and she was talking about her jewellery. And she says, Sharon, this little brooch, treasure it, because it's been passed down from generation to generation. She says it didn't only belong to your great-gran, it belonged to her gran. And my mum was never told about it. It was all kept a big secret, because my granddad didn't want the family to know, my granddad, that she was murdered by Jack the Ripper. So it was all kept a big secret. But my mum used to visit her gran very often. And my great-gran used to let things slip and tell like little bits. And my mum had got a very good idea. And my mum said to me, she says, this brooch was given by Catherine to the family who she lived with, because she was orphaned as a child, and she had to go and live with her uncle and aunt, which is my bloodline of the family. And she lived there, and she was like a daughter to them, and she was like a sister, not a cousin, to her cousins. And she gave this brooch
Sharon,
when she left to carry on with her life. And she says,
it's
you can have this
it's
brooch
remarkable.
because I know you'll treasure it. She says, I'll only end up calling
It's remarkable that you've kept it all these years through the family. I have to ask you something else. The way that this case, if it indeed is solved, has been solved through the other side, right? Through Erin Kuzminski's great-great-grand-niece. And I wondered if you would ever want to meet her and talk about what this has meant for both of you.
Well, yes, it would be very interesting. I believe his family was a bit upset about the findings. But to me, it's history. It's one of the important, the most famous crimes of all time. And so I was fascinated by the story. But it isn't only a couple of generations that it affected. It's what, even me as a child, I used to have nightmares from little bits that I obviously had heard me nan talk about with a sister, and I shouldn't have been listening. And I used to have nightmares as a child. So even me, 135 years later, when I was a child, I suffered.
Wow.
Sharon,
I can't tell you how much I appreciate you telling us this story, especially since it's the middle of the night where you are in London right now. I'd love to continue our conversation because I still think there's a lot more, especially if there's an inquest. I want to know, how you process this as the story progresses. Thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Unbelievable. Sharon Dutton wearing the brooch of one of Jack the Ripper's victims, Catherine Eddowes. Again, her great-great-great-aunt. Amazing. There's just so much more to say about Jack the Ripper and his century-long reign of terror. While his name continues to strike fear in the hearts of people worldwide, it is remarkable how much information people actually don't know about this infamous legend. How many victims? How were they found? And the morbid things that the murderer did and took with him. Those details are next.
Annie, worse than they were for Pop. He cut her throat, virtually down to the spinal cord. There's reports somewhere saying that he actually tried to cut her head off, but he didn't have the time. He then took his knife and he cut the front flap of skin from her rib cage right down past her pubes, and he laid it out to the side of her body. He then cut out the intestines, the neighbour's shoulder. He took her uterus, he cut it out and took it with him. And finally, she had some brass rings on her finger, he wrenched them off. Quite literally as if that wasn't a human being whatsoever. Now, she had a black eye. And everybody assumed initially that the Ripper had done that to her. In fact, one of her friends came forward and said, you know what, I gave that to Dark Annie. We got into a fight. Have a guess what they had a fist fight over?
The custody.
No, worse. Bar of soap.
Welcome back to our special on Jack the Ripper and what could be the oldest cold case ever solved. I want to give you fair warning. There's a lot of very uncomfortable information that is about to come your way. And when I say uncomfortable, very graphic. So if you are squeamish, if there are kids around, turn down the volume. Don't turn the channel. But there will be some pictures as well. These are artists' renditions and some photographs, and they're very uncomfortable. Obviously, you just heard a description of how the Ripper used his knife on his second victim, Annie Chapman. That's courtesy of the man who may have solved this case, Russell Edwards. After almost 140 years of legend and research, books and movies, not to mention sensational hype, you'd think almost nothing about Jack's reign of terror could come as news. But the full extent of the horrors that he inflicted on at least 5 unsuspecting women is so much worse than most people likely know. And what many people accept as fact, surprisingly, isn't. Like the women, they weren't all necessarily prostitutes, for one thing. At least there was no proof that they were. But we do know this: all of the victims' throats were cut. That may be how he started. And again, fair warning, graphic stuff coming. For one victim, the Ripper's third victim, Elizabeth Stride, the throat cutting, that was where it ended. The lack of any further mutilation in Stride's case led many to suspect that the Ripper had been interrupted in his work, or that Stride's killer might have actually been somebody else. The other victims, they weren't just slashed or stabbed. They were eviscerated. At least 3 of the women had organs removed from their bodies, which is one reason the killer was thought to be a doctor or a butcher or a barber. It was definitely someone who was good with a blade. It is possible there was even cannibalism. We do know all of this from the official case files, many of which were destroyed during the bombing of London in World War II. But Jack the Ripper prowled the streets and picked his victims a decade before police could even use fingerprints in court. And as primitive as policing was back then, they did keep good records, including diagrams, even photos, which even by today's standards are graphic. Of the 5 unspeakably horrible murders generally attributed to Jack the Ripper, the so-called canonical 5, as they're referred to, Mary Ann Nichols was the first. She was also known as Polly. Even before the Ripper was a name to be known and feared, Mary Ann's death cast a grim light on the Dickensian conditions and the crime in London's East End. Polly was lying on the ground with her left hand touching the gate. Her bonnet was next to her right hand. Her skirts were rumpled just above her knees. Her throat was severely cut from left to right. Her windpipe, her gullet, and her spinal cord had been cut through. The abdomen had been cut open from the center of the bottom of her ribs. Her stomach coating was cut in several pieces. There were 2 small stabs on her private parts. Her eyes were wide open and glassy. The Ripper's second known victim was Annie Chapman, known as Dark Annie. And again, fair warning here. Around 6 a.m. on the 8th of September in 1888, Annie was found on her back, with her feet flat on the ground, her legs bent. Her dress was pushed above her knees. Her left arm was across her left breast. Her right arm was at her side. Her earlobe was cut. Her limbs were not yet completely stiff, but rigor mortis was starting to set in. Her face was swollen and facing to the right. Her tongue was also swollen, but her lips were closed. There was a scarf around her neck. And you just heard what hell the Ripper inflicted from that tour guide's description at the top of this segment. The Ripper's 4th victim, Catherine Eddowes, also had her throat cut. Her intestines were drawn out and placed over her right shoulder and smeared with fecal matter. Another piece of her intestines placed between her left arm and her body. Her body was actually quite warm when they found her. Rigor mortis had not yet started. Her eyelids had been cut. The tip of her nose was detached. One of her earlobes was missing. And the killer carved inverted V's on both of her cheeks. Jack the Ripper's last known victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was mutilated more than the others, perhaps proof of the Ripper's escalation. Her thighs had been stripped with a blade, her abdomen removed, her breasts had been cut off, her arms were mutilated, her right ear was cut off, her face was slashed in all directions, and her neck was severed down to the spine. Her left femur was split, exposing the marrow. Her uterus, her kidneys, and one of her breasts were placed under her head. The other breast was placed by her right foot. Her liver was placed between her feet Her intestines were clumped by the right side of her body, but her heart was never found. Coming up, if Aaron Kosminski were on trial today, he'd be 159 years old. But more to the point, the DNA that links him to the murder and the mutilation of Catherine Eddowes and presumably the 4 other women, that DNA would be 136 years old. So would it hold up in court? We are going to put that question to the forensic test next.
The last day of Polly's life, she spent in that building right there. That used to be called the Frying Pan Pub. And in the daylight, you can see in the red tiles at the top, it still says the Frying Pan. It wasn't until they got to the mortuary that they actually realised when they took Polly's clothes off what he did to her. So he cut her throat basically down to the spinal cord. Disemboweled.
That again was Jack the Ripper historian Russell Edwards, who believes he can finally deliver justice to Mary Ann Nichols and the other victims. But you and I have seen our fair share of slam dunk cases that fall apart in court. There was male DNA found on that shawl beside Catherine Eddowes' butchered body, but this many years later, would that DNA evidence hold up in court? Would a jury agree that the DNA belonged to an immigrant barber named Aaron Kosminski? And in 2025, would they convict him of being Jack the Ripper? I want to bring in Jarrett Ambo. He's a criminal defense attorney and court-qualified forensic DNA interpretation expert. Great to have you on this special, Jarrett. I think that with all of the critics and naysayers who've sort of weighed in on this revelation this week, I had to get sort of down to the granular with you. Talk to me about your overall thoughts, first of all, on what we've heard about the shawl, the DNA, the testing, and then the genealogical link to a relative.
Well, I mean, I have to say my first thought was excitement, right? I mean, some possibility that some people would have answers, even generations later. Even just interested parties, people who enjoy the true crime genre, would have some idea of who actually committed these crimes. It's an exciting thing, right? The thought of, and when I read the news reports, I thought it's a 100% match. I mean, my sort of red flags went off, but I thought, wow, this is really amazing. I wanted to also get granular and figure out just what they had found. You know, what kind of DNA had they used? What did they find? Where did they find it? What was the connection? And so, you know, after your call earlier, I decided to really take a look at this and see what was going on in the case.
Okay, so give me your summary. What'd you find out, and then did you change how you felt about this miraculous news?
Yeah, I mean, not to blow the punchline, but yes. So the DNA used here is what's called mitochondrial DNA. It's a much smaller strand than the regular nuclear DNA we use to identify people, and as such, just right off the bat, it doesn't have the kind of power to identify someone individually that nuclear DNA has, or cellular DNA. This is DNA from a small organelle that's inside the cell, and the DNA strand is much, much smaller. We have the second problem of the fact that this DNA is degraded over years, right? DNA degrades in the environment when it interacts with oxygen, sunlight, heat. And so the strands of DNA that were measured in this particular case, they'd never been measured before in this manner. So they were very small strands, about 100 base pairs, compared to millions and millions and millions of base pairs normally. And so hundreds of base pairs long. And having not ever been compared before, there's no real statistical analysis on how rare they are, how much they occur in everyone's mitochondrial DNA, or everyone in that area in England and London. And so finding a few matches on a few of these sites, and in fact, in this particular case, 7 out of 9 sites, gives you some information, but it's not nearly enough information to say with any kind of certainty that this is the man that is Jack the Ripper. I mean, it is a mile from saying anything like
And the degradation, 135 years, you know, obviously this wasn't kept in an ice chest. It wasn't kept in serene conditions. It was thrown in the police lockup, eventually was out to auction and in history houses. So chain of custody, for one, I could see a good defense lawyer winning it on that alone. But the degradation I'm concerned about. However, you know, in the Brian Kohberger case, you've got a tiny, tiny little specimen of DNA that was sent down to Othram Labs in Texas. They were able to, I don't know the science, but develop it out into a sample that was, you know, robust enough for genealogical tracing. And I wonder if the same thing could happen here, or are we at a level with mitochondrial DNA that doesn't really pass that sniff test?
Yeah, this is apples to oranges. Nuclear DNA, you can develop a full nuclear profile, full DNA profile, or an identification profile today from a single cell. A single cell's worth of DNA. I mean, the kits that are used in labs today are unbelievably precise and unbelievably sensitive as to being able to extrapolate a full DNA profile from one or two or three, just a handful of cells. Mitochondrial DNA is a completely different matter, because not only is it a much smaller DNA molecule, which is why it's still here, right? Which is why it's not quite as degraded. The pieces of it are still able to be measured at the small level. But unfortunately, mitochondrial DNA is shared by everyone in the matrilineal line. So every mother to daughter, to daughter, to daughter, all the sisters, all of their daughters, and all the sisters at every generation and their daughters at every generation. And so there are a tremendous number of people. And in fact, the statistical use, the frequency used to say that this particular man matched, quote unquote, matched or was concordant with 7 of 9 locations they tested, still only turned out to be about 2% of the population of people in London at the time. So 2% of the population of the people in London would not have been excluded as a possible contributor to these possible small fragments of possible mitochondrial DNA left on an item that you indicated a moment ago traded hands over and over again between owners, between different custodians in different places, in museums and personal homes and collections, and down through family members. And so there's another assertion inside this analysis that says, well, we found new DNA, or DNA that was complete, that we can decide was the last owner's DNA, and then we found some old DNA that was degraded and incomplete, and that must be the historical DNA. But what about all the other people that touched this item in the 137 years between the date of the murder and the date it was tested? The information just isn't there in the science to be able to show exactly when the DNA was deposited and by whom.
So I only have time for a one-word answer, but I think I know what it is. This would or would not stand up in court?
It would not.
I had a feeling that's what you were going to say. Jared Ambo, I'm so appreciative of your wisdom. Man, you are a smart cookie. Thank you so much for being here on the Friday Night Special.
Thank you for having me. Good night.
So fascinating, isn't it? But if not Kosminski, then who else? Who else was on the radar at Scotland Yard 100 years ago? Well, it turns out they had plenty of suspects, some much closer to the victims than you would think. We've got the Rogues Gallery lined up for you in just a moment. But first, Jack the Ripper's story has been told in thousands of books and dozens of movies. Even Johnny Depp took a turn.
Recite the solemn.
Never to reveal our secret.
But what was the panic really like on the streets of London's East End? We're going to take you back in time for a terrifying tour through the headlines as only Fleet Street could print. That's coming up next.
So we're actually at the murder scene of the third Ripper victim, Elizabeth Stride. Now Elizabeth Stride was actually seen being attacked by a man described between 5'5" and 5'7", broad shoulders, foreign, which meant Jewish, dark hair, dark moustache. It was actually at this location, precise location by the way, And he's quite literally trying to drag this woman into the ground and into this gateway.
The night became known as the double event. Jack the Ripper claimed the lives of 2 women just hours apart and doubled his known body count to 4. His 5th and last known murder happened a few weeks later in early November. But why did the murders stop? Not everybody's convinced that they did, actually, and some believe that other people killed the 5 victims that are blamed on the Ripper. The mystery of it all, on top of the ghastly killings themselves, made for generations of blockbuster movies. But surely Hollywood exaggerated the panic on the cobblestone streets of Whitechapel. Not even close, folks, honestly. Here are the real headlines from the London Daily Post. Jack the Ripper murders again. Double event in London's East End. And later, Jack the Ripper claims 5th victim, woman brutally hacked to death. And then there's ghastly murder in the East End, dreadful mutilation of a woman, capture, leather apron, possibly a reference to the barbers and the butchers who wore leather aprons. And then this in the London Evening News, the horror in Whitechapel grows. Jack the Ripper butchers 2 more women. Illustrated Police News ran this one, portrait sketches of supposed Whitechapel monster and incidents in the case. And another one, the Mitre Square victim before and after death. And right below that, sketches of the fiendish work of the monster of Whitechapel, his 6 crimes. Which maybe answers my question as to why he decided to hang up his knife. Maybe, just maybe, the heat was too much. Or maybe he was caught for something else. Because we do know that Aaron Kosminski, at least, spent the rest of his life locked up in what they called back then a lunatic asylum. So is the most famous cold case in the world really solved? Because if it's not, it's closer than it's ever been in 137 years. But that still leaves an outside chance that the Ripper is someone else, someone other than Aaron Kosminski, the immigrant barber. But if not Aaron, who? We are running through the suspects, including some surprises, next.
Ripper did have time to do what he did with Mary Kelly. She was butchered, mutilated to a point where she was hardly recognisable. The one big significant thing is they never found a heart.
So was Aaron Kosminski the infamous Jack the Ripper? The DNA evidence strongly suggests it, or maybe not. And back in the 1880s, he was actually a suspect early on. But there were other suspects too. Today, they'd be actually called persons of interest. And believe it or not, they ranged from the Elephant Man to the grandson of Queen Victoria. It takes all kinds. Francis Craig was neither of those two, but he was the husband of Mary Jane Kelly, the Ripper's 5th and last known victim. One theory holds that Mr. Craig hated his wife's decision to be a sex worker and killed her to stop her. And the theory went that he killed 4 other women before Mary to fool the police. Diabolical? Probably, but wrong. But then there was the suggestion that American serial killer H.H. Holmes was the Ripper because he was behind a string of murders during Chicago's World's Fair, and he was known to have traveled to Europe around the time of the Whitechapel murders. For her part, the author Patricia Cornwell claims to have evidence implicating a German-born artist named Walter Sickert. Cornwell claims that Mr. Sickert is linked through DNA to the so-called Ripper letters, which were mailed to police and to the press. Other names on the table include Montague John Druitt, a mentally unstable barrister who took his own life weeks after the Ripper murders. There's also a German sailor named Karl Feigenbaum, and the royal suspect is Prince Albert Victor, known as Prince Eddie. By comparison, the case against Aaron Kosminski, the Polish-born schizophrenic barber, actually looks pretty ironclad, but proved beyond a reasonable doubt? For now, you'll have to be the judge. Thanks for watching, everybody. Check out my podcast, Drop Dead Serious. Almost next. Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your screen. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.